This poor man had just finished work and was about to go home when he was suddenly hit from behind by someone driving a car. He got out of the car angrily and wanted to question the person who caused the accident. Unexpectedly, he saw the other person driving a Rolls-Royce. Inside the car was a young woman who exuded luxury and wealth. The man saw this and immediately changed his expression to a gentle one. He didn't even dare to ask the woman to explain. Unexpectedly, when the man turned around, he saw that the woman was bleeding. It was obvious that she had a miscarriage. Gong Ryong was an obstetrician, so he immediately carried the woman to the hospital. He then made a plan to perform emergency surgery on her until the girl took off her sunglasses, and only then did Gong Ryong realize that she was the daughter of the nation's top tycoon. Go-eun had just broken up with her boyfriend and was feeling down, convinced that there were no good men left in the world. Faced with a millionaire heiress, Gong Ryong didn't try to flatter her, but his tone was gentle. He reassured Go-eun to trust her doctor and everything would be fine. Go-eun then entered the anesthesia phase, and the surgery was carried out to remove the child from her womb. Unexpectedly, a few days later, a group of men in black stormed into Gong Ryong's office, forcibly dragged him into a car. Inside was Go-eun's father, the chairman of the most powerful conglomerate in South Korea. The moment he saw Gong Ryong, the chairman yelled at him, accusing him of severing his family's bloodline and demanding that Gong Ryong take full responsibility. That night, under the chairman's orders, the subordinates dragged Gong Ryong to the seaside to throw him into the ocean. On the brink of life and death, Gong Ryong still held firmly to his beliefs as a doctor and stated plainly that, for the safety of the mother, he would make the same decision again if given the chance. In the end, the chairman spared Gong Ryong's life out of mercy, but as punishment, he was fired. From that moment on, no hospital was willing to hire Gong Ryong again. Desperate to find work, Gong Ryong made countless phone calls, but even the worst jobs weren't available to him. Then one day, Go-eun suddenly appeared and told him she would compensate him. She had seen everything, how the chairman scolded Gong Ryong, and realized that this might truly be a rare good man. However, Gong Ryong felt nothing but resentment toward Go-eun, because it was because of her that he had lost his entire career. Even the lowest jobs wouldn't take him. Unexpectedly, Go-eun suddenly grabbed Gong Ryong and kissed him passionately. After the kiss, she confessed that she really liked him. Gong Ryong was utterly shocked and, in his confusion, quickly rejected the rich heiress's confession. But not long after, one night while he was drunk at a small local eatery, Go-eun appeared again. This time, taking advantage of his drunken state, Gong Ryong threw himself into Go-eun's arms, and that night, the two had a passionate night together. Afterward, Go-eun once again boldly expressed her love, this time even more directly. She told Gong Ryong that she wanted to marry him. Gong Ryong thought he wasn't worthy of her, yet for some reason, he no longer refused. From that moment, the poor man Gong Ryong suddenly became the future son-in-law of a wealthy family. Not long after, the conglomerate spent an enormous sum of 700 billion won to send Gong Ryong into space for an 8-day mission. His task was to research the mystery of sperm genetics in a space laboratory. That night, the spaceship carrying Gong Ryong entered its countdown for launch. As the command was given from Earth, the rocket launched into the night sky toward the vastness of space. However, just seconds after takeoff, it was struck by lightning. Gong Ryong, who had never experienced outer space before, was nearly in shock. Fortunately, the spacecraft was well designed and managed to pass through the storm safely, continuing its ascent. Once the ship entered Earth's orbit, Gong Ryong saw the blue planet from a unique perspective for the first time. Since it was his first time in space, he couldn't hold back from severe space sickness, even experiencing hallucinations. He saw a human corpse in a spacesuit walking outside. Gong Ryong couldn't stop vomiting, and soon after, he began experiencing airway obstruction, eventually losing consciousness. Commander Eve immediately began emergency treatment. The space environment was extremely unique. They had only 7 minutes to save Gong Ryong before he would die. Eve contacted the medical team on Earth for direct guidance. Following instructions, they had to use a method to remove the obstruction. Inside the zero-gravity spacecraft, Eve braced her foot against the elevator from behind and used all her strength to perform abdominal thrusts on Gong Ryong. Eventually, thanks to Eve's efforts, the foreign object in Gong Ryong's esophagus was successfully expelled. When he regained consciousness, the first person he saw was the beautiful Commander Eve, who had injured her toe during the rescue. Eve had her own story. She once had a romantic relationship with a colleague at the Earth Command Center, but their missions forced them to part temporarily. Once Gong Ryong's vital signs stabilized, he contacted the command center and knew that what he had seen earlier was not a hallucination. It wasn't a corpse, but a satellite made from an abandoned spacesuit. While Gong Ryong was alone, Eve came in and tucked a thermometer inside his suit, making him suddenly feel hot. When their break time arrived, they shut off communication with Earth. Gong Ryong kindly reminded Eve that her toe was still bleeding. As he attempted first aid, he discovered that the wound was severe. A simple band-aid wouldn't be enough. Eve needed surgery to stop the bleeding. Gong Ryong confidently opened the medical kit and pulled out a needle and thread. However, In the zero-gravity environment, it was difficult for him to maintain balance. Despite trying many times, he just couldn't thread the needle. Eve couldn't bear to watch any longer, so she quickly snatched the needle and thread from him. Drawing on her experience as a commander, Eve succeeded in threading it in a single attempt. She then assigned the remaining task, anesthetizing and stitching the wound, to Gong Ryong. However, the syringe for the anesthetic had mysteriously disappeared from the first aid kit. Panicking, Gong Ryong searched everywhere for it, but Eve told him to proceed with the stitching anyway. To her, a bit of pain was nothing. When Gong Ryong hesitated, Eve even offered to do it herself. That finally pushed Gong Ryong to start stitching and bandaging the wound. The entire procedure went smoothly. After finishing the operation, Gong Ryong suddenly saw the missing syringe floating right in front of him. Startled, he carefully blew it away, not forgetting to secretly glance at Eve's reaction. Eve simply patted his shoulder and went downstairs. Gong Ryong then muttered to himself that Eve's toes were really beautiful. While Gong Ryong was in space, his girlfriend, Go-eun, was constantly worried about him. In fact, this mission into space was a secret assignment given by the chairman. If Gong Ryong failed to complete it, the chairman would force him to break up with Go-eun. Go-eun was filled with anxiety, often reminiscing about their past together. She remembered the time she confessed her feelings to Gong Ryong, only for him not to return her words of love. He merely said he would never betray her. As Go-eun was lost in her memories, her ex-boyfriend called. Her ex was a space scientist, currently also floating somewhere in the vast universe. It seemed he still had feelings for her. Over the phone, he declared that if Gong Ryong didn't treat her well, he would take her back. According to the pre-arranged plan, after entering Earth's orbit, the spacecraft needed to dock with the International Space Station. After a series of procedures, the connection between the two sides was successfully completed. Before opening the hatch, Gong Ryong took out a package. This was a gift he had prepared for the scientists. Everything was ready, but unexpectedly, Eve became fascinated by a few flies inside the cabin. She stared at them, visibly excited. The flies were resting on the surface of a banana. In front of her, a male and a female fly began to mate. Eve quickly pulled out a magnifying glass to observe more closely. This was the act of creating life in space. Gong Ryong was drawn in as well, watching alongside her. According to Eve, fly mating could last up to 20 minutes, even longer than in humans. Seeing Eve so joyful, Gong Ryong's gaze unintentionally softened. After the flies finished mating, Eve carefully placed them into a test tube. She reminded Gong Ryong that in space, the most important thing was to create and protect life. But Gong Ryong started joking, saying he would name the male fly Gong Ryong and the female fly Eve. Eve firmly rejected the idea and told him to call her Commander only. After securing the flies properly, Eve opened the hatch. Gong Ryong clumsily floated out of the module. He still hadn't gotten used to the zero-gravity environment. He met several scientists aboard the space station, one of whom, named Kan-su, turned out to be Go-eun's ex-boyfriend. After the introduction, Gong Ryong unwrapped the gift he had brought, a selection of ice cream in various flavors. But in fact, the delicious, melt-in-your-mouth ice cream held a secret tied to Gong Ryong's mission in space. It turned out that the chairman's son was infertile, something that had long troubled the chairman. Some time ago, his daughter-in-law Min Jung had given him a report. According to scientific research, in a zero-gravity environment, deformed sperm can straighten and recover normally. In order to secure succession of the corporation, Min Jung proposed sending Gong Ryong into space to secretly fertilize her egg there. Upon receiving the chairman's orders, Gong Ryong's first reaction was to refuse. Sending human eggs into space was completely against protocol, but the chairman revealed that his son's sperm had already been sent into space earlier. Gong Ryong only needed to bring the egg. If the chairman succeeded in having a grandson, he would seriously consider Gong Ryong's relationship with his daughter. Even when the chairman got down on his knees and begged, Gong Ryong still firmly refused. Later, Gong Ryong met Min Jung to try and persuade her to give up the idea. However, Min Jung was even more determined than the chairman. In fact, she was Gong Ryong's colleague, a pediatrician who loved children. She earnestly pleaded with Gong Ryong to help fulfill her wish of becoming a mother. In the end, Gong Ryong was moved and agreed to carry out the secret mission. Min Jung's egg was hidden at the bottom of a vanilla ice cream container. Now in space, Gong Ryong distributed ice cream to everyone, each flavor carefully chosen based on their preferences. After handing them out, 2 sticks remained. Among them was the vanilla ice cream containing Min Jung's egg. By coincidence, Eve happened to pick up the vanilla one. Gong Ryong panicked, rushed after her, and asked her to return it. But Eve grew suspicious. According to protocol, everyone going into space was required to declare all personal items they brought along. Gong Ryong insisted that he had declared everything, but Eve wouldn't let it go. She knew he had only listed 5 ice creams in his inventory, and the vanilla one wasn't among them. Panicking, Gong Ryong started lying, saying he had just accidentally brought a small cup of ice cream and that it was no big deal, just a small oversight. However, suspected he had hidden something dangerous inside, and even placed the ice cream into the oven to melt it completely so she could clearly see what was inside. Gong Ryong, a alarmed, immediately tried to take it out, but Eve pointed a gun at him from behind, forcing him to freeze. Taking the opportunity, Eve scooped a spoonful of the melted ice cream and placed it into a testing device. Fortunately, the results showed it was completely non-toxic, with a 100% safety rating. Relieved, Eve handed a spoonful back to Gong Ryong to eat. Trying to avoid suspicion, Gong Ryong reluctantly ate it. But just as he finished, Eve snatched the container from him, reminding him that in space, reducing waste volume was important. Without hesitation, she threw the cup into the trash bag. Watching this, Gong Ryong gasped in fury and quickly pulled the cup out of the trash, then frantically opened the bottom. To his shock, Minjun's egg was gone. What Gong Ryong didn't know was that the real ice cream cup containing the eggs was now in the hands of Goen's ex-boyfriend, Kang Soo. Not only did Kang Soo get the egg, but he also obtained the sperm of the chairman's son. At this point, Goen finally realized her father had deceived her boyfriend. In truth, Gong Ryong was merely a delivery man tasked with bringing the eggs into space hidden in the ice cream. The embryo experiment had nothing to do with him. Clearly, the chairman didn't trust Gong Ryong's abilities and never actually considered marrying off his daughter to him. Desperate, Gong Ryong searched the entire space station for the eggs. At that moment, Goen called him and revealed everything. Upon knowing the truth, Gong Ryong immediately confronted Kang Soo and demanded the eggs back. But with a mere gesture, Kang Soo sent Gong Ryong tumbling like a puppet across the space station. Kang Soo still wouldn't give up. He insulted Gong Ryong, calling him a poor nobody, unworthy of marrying a chaebol heiress. Kang Soo advised him to stop deluding himself and give up while he could, insisting that he and Goen were the ones truly meant for each other. Kang Soo wasn't just a scientist specializing in fruit flies and infertility, he was also the heir to a global banking empire. But Gong Ryong wasn't someone who gave up easily. He had already made a deal with Chairman to establish a reproductive clinic in space to help people with infertility conceive children. Driven by this noble mission, Gong Ryong entered his second day aboard the space station. Just then, an alarm blared through the station. Experimental mouse number 1, a female, was biting the other 2 mice. Ground control ordered Eve to euthanize mouse number 1, but she was too afraid, terrified of taking a life in the vacuum of space. Suddenly, mouse number 1 suffered a heart attack. The scientists were at a loss. Gong Ryong proposed performing open-heart surgery on the mouse, a procedure he had done over 100 times on newborns. With Eve's approval, Gong Ryong sprang into action, pressing on the tiny heart of the mouse as its breathing grew weaker. Meanwhile, Kang Soo stood nearby, mocking him with sarcastic remarks. But Gong Ryong refused to give in. The dying mouse in front of him mirrored his own desperate situation. He saw himself in it, and that gave him a surge of resolve. Then he switched places with Eve, and they continued chest compressions together. Perhaps it was the power of belief, but eventually, thanks to their combined efforts, the mouse's heartbeat was restored. Seeing a tiny life saved, Eve was so overjoyed that she burst into tears. In her excitement, she hugged Gong Ryong tightly and praised him as the most wonderful doctor. She even specially allowed Gong Ryong to call her by her name. Gong Ryong's heart raced uncontrollably at Eve's admiring gaze and smile. Today, the expedition team and scientists were resting. Kang Soo suggested watching the lottery results together. As the commander, Eve went into the lounge to find Gong Ryong to join them. Gong Ryong was looking at photos of his girlfriend, but his mind kept replaying the image of Eve hugging him. Not long ago, after calling Gong Ryong, the group gathered in front of the screen, intently following the lottery draw. During this time, Kang Soo volunteered to get coffee for everyone. What no one knew was that while they were focused on the lottery results, Kang Soo secretly entered the laboratory to prepare fertilization for the eggs Gong Ryong had brought. After a series of experiments, Kang Soo, as a scientist, succeeded in normalizing the sperm in the zero-gravity environment. Unfortunately, Gong Ryong came looking for him. Not wanting to get caught, Kang Soo only injected 7 eggs and quickly ended the process. He then called the chairman to share this good news, confident that these 7 eggs would successfully fertilize, resulting in 7 grandchildren. The chairman felt very lucky to have entrusted this important task to Kang Soo instead of Gong Ryong. Gong Ryong sneaked to the frozen storage to steal the frozen eggs, but didn't know the code to open the freezer. At that moment, Eve announced that tomorrow, the expedition team would conduct a spacewalk, so they needed to repair a damaged solar panel in space. Gong Ryong realized this was a perfect chance to create a distraction. It was the perfect opportunity for Gong Ryong to steal back the eggs. Moreover, Eve revealed to him that Kang Soo would be participating in the spacewalk scheduled for tomorrow. During that time, Kang Soo would be outside the station for several hours. Gong Ryong was thrilled and quickly asked Eve if there was a chance someone might not return from a spacewalk. Unexpectedly, Eve replied that spacewalking was extremely dangerous. In addition to Kang Soo, she herself would also be joining. Hearing this, Gong Ryong grew anxious about Eve's safety. Before they came to space, Eve had told him that going on a spacewalk was like choosing death. Even experienced astronauts would write their wills before such missions, because the tiniest mistake, like a small tear in a glove, could be fatal in under 2 minutes. Commander Eve had long since accepted the fact that her life could end at any moment, but Gong Ryong responded seriously, saying that as the leader, she should carry the belief that she would survive until the end. Eve brushed him off, calling him nosy, but deep down, she felt a sense of warmth. To prepare for the worst before embarking on the spacewalk, Eve began writing her will. Meanwhile, Kang-soo was on a video call to Earth with his ex-girlfriend. Go-in berated him harshly, accusing him of being shameless. She demanded he return Min-jung's egg to Gong Ryong, saying that it was something Gong Ryong should be the one to do. But of course, Kang-soo refused. Not only did he want to take Min-jung's eggs, but he also wanted to compete with Gong Ryong for Go-in. Furious, Go-in couldn't hold back. On the other end of the line, she unleashed a storm of curses, using every vulgar word she could think of to lash out at Kang-soo. However, what nobody expected was that Kang-soo was not someone easily provoked. The more Go-in scolded fiercely, the more Kang-soo found her beautiful and charming. Go-in couldn't even understand how she had once loved such an inferior man. She said that when he returned, she would teach him a lesson. While the astronauts were all preparing for the upcoming mission, Gong Ryong once again sneaked to the freezer, but was powerless because he couldn't enter the correct password. In urgency, Gong Ryong contacted a doctor friend on Earth and explained the situation, that a woman's eggs had been taken, asking for advice. Hearing the sound of the centrifuge spinning nearby Gong Ryong, his friend confirmed that if the centrifuge overheated, it could explode. The space station's power would then be suddenly cut to prevent danger to the experiment subject in case of fire. At that time, the freezer would automatically open. Gong Ryong then came up with a plan. He intended to make the treadmill run until it caught fire, triggering the fire alarm automatically. His friend warned him this was very dangerous, but Gong Ryong insisted on going through with it. This was his only chance to retrieve Min-jung's eggs. Meanwhile, Eve had finished writing and printing her last letter when she noticed a test tube under the computer. Excited, she went to find Gong Ryong and saw photos of Go-in hanging in both Gong Ryong's and Kang-soo's resting rooms. She suddenly felt Go-in was very lucky to be loved by two men. At the same time, Eve handed the test tube to Gong Ryong to look at. It contained the result of the mating between the two flies. Eve was as delighted as a child because creating life in zero gravity was truly no easy feat. Eve reminded Gong Ryong that under no circumstances could Kang-soo find out about this. Otherwise, the two flies would surely be treated as test subjects and face cruel experimentation. Gong Ryong firmly stated that he wouldn't let Kang-soo take away anything else that belonged to him. Noticing that Gong Ryong was fidgety because of his girlfriend, Eve teased him. Gong Ryong said he hoped that once they returned to Earth, he could meet Eve in a gravity-filled environment. Eve smiled gently and handed him her will. No one knew if she would make it back to Earth safely after this mission. At that moment, seeing that the two flies in the test tube were about to reproduce, Eve laughed with joy. Gong Ryong, too, was excited and happy. Finally, the time came for the spacewalk mission. While Eve and Kang-soo were heading toward the assigned location, Gong Ryong made his way to the cold storage unit. He called Min-jung to ask whether she wanted Kang-soo to be in charge of her egg. Fortunately, Min-jung didn't trust Kang-soo. She trusted Gong Ryong, a responsible OBGYN. She needed him to continuously monitor the development of the embryo and promised to convince the chairman to let him perform the operation. Being entrusted with such responsibility gave Gong Ryong peace of mind and erased all his doubts. He resolved to retrieve the egg at all costs. After ending the call with Min-jung, Gong Ryong followed through with the plan and began frantically running on the treadmill. Meanwhile, Eve and Kang-soo, suited in their spacesuits, had started repairing the solar panels. A few hours later, most of the work was nearly done when Kang-soo's glove encountered an issue. Ground control immediately ordered him to return to the station, and Eve also urged him to head back at once, or he would be putting his life in danger. With the main tasks completed, the remaining work would be finished by Eve alone. Kang-soo returned to the space station. At the same time, an alarm sounded throughout the station. It was triggered by Gong Ryong's intense workout on the treadmill. The motor was overloaded and sparked. As Gong Ryong had predicted, the space station's emergency system cut power, unlocking all equipment in the laboratory, including the freezer. Taking advantage of this moment, Gong Ryong quickly retrieved the eggs from the freezer and hid them inside his portable music player. Since there was only smoke and no actual fire, the alarm was lifted a few minutes later and the power to the space station was restored. The other astronauts suspected nothing. Overjoyed to have Min-jung's eggs back, Gong Ryong felt immense relief. When the crisis ended, Eve continued to work alone on the final repairs. Unexpectedly, during the process, she made a mistake. The tool on the rail was accidentally released into space. Any tool falling like this could become a dangerous object, hitting the space station. Because of this, Eve tried to reach out and grab the tool, but unfortunately slipped off the mount. Her body began drifting in space, creating a very dangerous situation. Using the safety tether attached to her, Eve tried to grab the solar panel to stabilize herself, but in doing so, her glove was pierced by components of the solar panel. The colleagues inside the station tried to maneuver to bring Eve back, but were were powerless due to the great distance. If this continued, Eve would run out of oxygen within minutes and die. Even more dangerous was that the damaged area on her glove kept increasing. The spacesuit's system issued warnings that Eve's oxygen levels were steadily dropping. At the same time, Gong-ryong read the farewell letter Eve had left for him. In the letter, Eve recalled the most important person in her life, her foster father, an astronaut from America. He had sacrificed his life during a spacewalk to save a fellow crewmate. Eva's adoptive father left her a letter before his death. In the vast universe, all life is equal and miraculous. Humans are not gods. Because of his dying wish, Eve learned to cherish every living being. In her own letter, every part of her final will was about life. She reminded Gong-ryong to take good care of the injured crew members, the lab mice, and many other things. She even repeatedly reminded him about eating chili paste and dealing with bodily waste. In zero gravity, every human action is connected to life itself. One thing she emphasized most was this: no matter what happened, Gong-ryong must stay in place. She wanted him to value his own life. If Gong-ryong could follow her instructions, then Eve promised that when she returned to Earth someday, she would definitely invite him for a drink. Gong-ryong obeyed her words completely until an emergency alert came from the space station. The worst had truly happened. Gong-ryong quickly checked on Eve's current situation. Due to the distance, Eve could no longer reach the robotic arm, so her entire body was left lying on the solar panel. As her oxygen continued to deplete, she could no longer remain fully conscious. With coordination from Mission Control on Earth, Eve used the last of her strength to try to anchor herself. But Mission Control was ultimately helpless in the current situation. Everyone was panicking as they watched Eve's life slip into danger. Suddenly, a hatch inside the space station opened without warning. Gong-ryong had disobeyed her orders. As a civilian passenger, he had put on a spacesuit to venture into space. With no experience, half of Gong-ryong's body was now dangerously dangling in open space. Moreover, because Gong-ryong did not perform decompression procedures before putting on his spacesuit, he might also die in space. Gong-ryong, however, paid little attention and kept moving forward continuously. Due to the distance, he could not see the location of the tether. Gong-ryong shouted at the top of his lungs, waking the nearly unconscious Eve to show him the position of the tether. In that moment, Eve secretly shed a tear. At the same time, she regained her composure and pointed out the tether's location to Gong-ryong. Following her guidance, Gong-ryong steadily moved in one direction. Finally, he successfully grabbed the tether. Thanks to the tether, Gong-ryong led Eve back to the space station safely before their oxygen ran out. After a night of oxygen supply and physical adjustment, Eve, who had been unconscious, woke up. The first image in her mind was Gong-ryong risking his life to save her. Gong-ryong also woke up not long after. Once recovered, he called his good friend on Earth to report that he was safe. His friend revealed to him that just recently, his girlfriend had publicly announced their engagement to the media by herself. A few minutes earlier, Go-won had announced the wedding news without informing her father. She said that when her boyfriend returned to Earth, they would hold the wedding ceremony. However, Gong-ryong was not happy upon hearing this news. His mind was full of thoughts about Eve's health. At the space station, Gong-ryong and Eve took turns going to the restroom. Seeing Eve was safe, Gong-ryong breathed a sigh of relief and smiled. Unexpectedly, he was slapped by Eve. She clearly explained everything. As an astronaut, she was prepared to sacrifice at any moment, but Gong-ryong was just an ordinary space tourist. As the commander, she could not let him die in space too. Gong-ryong could not argue and had to apologize. He promised never to repeat the mistake. Eve immediately ordered Gong-ryong that before returning to Earth, he was not allowed to take any action that crossed the line. In fact, he wasn't even allowed to appear in front of her. Upon hearing that, Gong-ryong repeatedly begged her. The space station was so small, how could he possibly avoid Eve completely? But Eve showed no mercy and coldly turned her back on him. Of course, what Gong-ryong didn't know was that Eve had her own reasons for saying such harsh words. In reality, when she was alone gazing into the vast universe, she felt overwhelmed. The image that kept lingering in her mind was Gong-ryong's gentle gaze. Kong-soo then mocked and threatened Gong-ryong, saying that based on regulations, Gong-ryong's unauthorized actions were against the rules and deserved punishment. Gong-ryong didn't back down and told Kong-soo that he had already taken back Min-jung's eggs. Unexpectedly, Kong-soo became even more aggressive. He revealed that the experiment had long been completed. Out of the 7 fertilized eggs, 6 had developed successfully. Hearing that made Gong-ryong even more disheartened. But in truth, Kong-soo was just as dejected because he had seen the news that Go-won had announced her engagement to Gong-ryong. That evening, Gong-ryong went to the 2 remaining astronauts, hoping to ask for a place to sleep. They agreed and even brought out some rare liquor they had secretly stashed away, planning to drink with Gong-ryong until they were drunk. They told him that in such a silent and suffocating place, alcohol was their only joy and emotional support. Before going to sleep, the 2 astronauts handed the remaining liquor to Gong-ryong. To them, Gong-ryong was a hero. After they left the sleeping area one by one, Gong-ryong stayed behind alone, floating in zero gravity, savoring the liquor in comfort. His depressed mood had finally lifted a little. Perhaps because he drank alcohol late at night, Gong Ryong could not sleep. He paced back and forth inside the space station, reminding the scientists. He told one scientist to definitely use mice to develop a vaccine for Alzheimer's disease. Then he went to see another space scientist named Mina. The other day, while everyone was checking the lottery results, Mina happened to find a winning lottery ticket with a prize of 5 trillion. The owner of the ticket was Kang Soo, but he did not know yet. Mina's sister had told her to sew the ticket into her underwear. When Mina returned to Earth, the two sisters would go cash it. At that time, they could become rich women overnight. Following her sister's instructions, Mina planned to sew the lottery ticket into her underwear. Unexpectedly, Gong Ryong suddenly appeared. It turned out that Gong Ryong had seen Mina picking up the lottery ticket. Seeing this, Mina panicked and lied that she intended to return the ticket to Kang Soo. Unexpectedly, Gong Ryong advised Mina not to be too honest. After all, Kang Soo came from a family with millions and would not miss this small pocket money. Gong Ryong promised to help Mina keep the secret. In return, Gong Ryong hoped Mina would help him once without asking why. After jumping around once in the space station, Gong Ryong sneaked into the laboratory to try to conduct embryo experiments. Unfortunately, in zero gravity, even the eggs could not stay balanced. Gong Ryong had to temporarily give up the experiment. Seeing Eve's resting room at the end of the corridor, Gong Ryong mustered all his courage and walked straight in. It turned out Eve was also not sleeping. She was secretly listening to the sounds Gong Ryong made outside. At that moment, Gong Ryong's eyes were full of affection as he looked straight at Eve. Then he, like a child, asked Eve to praise the savior who had saved his life. Eve smelled the alcohol on Gong Ryong. She intended to question him, but he spoke first, asking if he could like her. Eve avoided his gaze, but Gong Ryong's eyes were full of affection. He didn't even know when he had started liking Eve. After a brief moment of hesitation, Eve replied with a firm no. She believed his confession was just drunk nonsense, and more importantly, both of them already had lovers of their own. But Gong Ryong, speaking with sincerity, said he would be returning to Earth in just a few days, and he hoped to hear her answer before he left. Eve, however, coldly pushed Gong Ryong out of her quarters. Yet after he left, she grew restless. She quietly opened the door to peek outside and saw that he still hadn't gone. Gong Ryong figured she was curious about him. As an OB/GYN doctor, most women in his life had always been either pregnant patients or medical cases. Only Eve was different, someone who truly moved his heart. But Eve still rejected him. She didn't want any involvement with the fiancé of a chaebol heiress. Gong Ryong promised he would end things with his girlfriend once he returned to Earth. He asked Eve if a year from now she had broken up with her boyfriend, or if that man wasn't better than him, would she give him a chance? Eve responded with a strict order that Gong Ryong must absolutely not fall for her. She even told him flat out that he wasn't as good as her boyfriend. Hearing this, Gong Ryong felt crushed. Little did he know, the woman who just rejected him had a heart pounding uncontrollably. Meanwhile on Earth, former spaceship commander Tae-hee looked at an old photo, one of herself, Eve and Eve's ex-boyfriend, Dong-ah. Tae-hee had once led Eve and Dong-ah on a space exploration mission. One day, Dong-ah suddenly grabbed Tae-hee's hand and asked if she'd give him the watch on her wrist. But while joking around, Dong-ah also showed tenderness toward Eve, who at that time was venturing into space for the very first time and was feeling a bit anxious inside. Dong-ah gently encouraged that the spacesuit suited Eve very well. Remembering that moment, Tae-hee felt jealous of Eve because she had always liked Dong-ah. Tae-hee backed the car up with a sigh, thinking that happiness no longer belonged to her. Unexpectedly, Dong-ah got into Tae-hee's car without permission. He was about to resign and leave the ground control center. Tae-hee frankly said she didn't want him to leave. Gong Ryong kept his promise. That day, he called Go-eun. Go-eun thought her boyfriend was blaming her for not informing him before announcing their engagement. But Gong Ryong said he wasn't worthy of Go-eun and would not get engaged to her. Because of Gong Ryong's words, Go-eun was in a bad mood the whole next day. Still, she decided to possess Gong Ryong. She even knelt before her father, the chairman, inside the elevator, hoping he would allow her to be with Gong Ryong. The chairman noticed Gong Ryong didn't like his daughter, so he advised her to care more about Kang Soo, who truly loved her. Go-eun did not appreciate Kang Soo. She firmly believed Kang Soo's embryo experiment in space would fail. Min-jung asked Gong Ryong's friend about progress. The friend reported that Gong Ryong had successfully retrieved the eggs, and they only needed to conduct the experiment now. Min-jung sighed with relief. At that moment, the chairman called Min-jung to attend a meeting led by the scientists. The Academy of Sciences had observed Kang Soo's experiment results and confirmed that out of 7 eggs, 6 had been successfully fertilized. The chairman immediately became delighted and joyful. He believed he had judged Kang Soo correctly and asked Min-jung to choose between Kang Soo and Gong Ryong. He heard that the fertilized eggs could be implanted into the uterus as soon as tonight. After some hesitation, Min-jung, who usually liked to oppose the chairman, ended up choosing Kang Soo. She had no other choice because her desire to have a child of her own was too strong. That night, Gong Ryong received received a call from Min Jung. Unaware of what had happened, he was still in a cheerful mood and planned to begin the IVF's procedure that evening. Unexpectedly, Min Jung ordered him to stop, saying that if Gong Ryong were caught, it could jeopardize Kang Soo's research results. Hearing that, Gong Ryong once again felt disheartened and deeply wished he could return to Earth immediately. Eve was just as downcast. She made a video call to her boyfriend Dong-ah, but what she saw on the screen were women's underwear scattered all over the place. At that moment, Dong-ah was actually in bed with Tae-hee. Thinking the video had already disconnected, the two began to get intimate on the other side. During the encounter, Tae-hee asked Dong-ah about his feelings for Eve. In a heavy tone, Dong-ah said that Eve didn't understand men at all. Eve's emotions completely collapsed. She went to ask Gong Ryong where he had hidden the alcohol. Still angry, Gong Ryong lied and said he didn't know. Eve took her frustration out on him, cursing all terrible men non-stop. She claimed that once men took off their pants they were just mammals. Gong Ryong thought she was talking about him, so he told her to stop. At that moment, Tae-hee, the one who had just cheated with Dong, reached out to Eve. Eve was about to curse her out but held back and said nothing. On the other end, Tae-hee acted like nothing had happened and reminded Eve to fulfill her duties as a commander. Meanwhile, scientist Mina contacted her sister on Earth. Mina talked about how Gong Ryong had seen her picking up a lottery ticket, and now she was deeply worried whether he would actually keep it a secret. Moreover, she also worried about something bad happening if Kang Soo found out she secretly took his lottery ticket. Unexpectedly, this conversation was overheard by another scientist named Song Joon. Knowing that Mina had a lottery ticket worth 5 trillion, Song Joon could not restrain himself. He started daydreaming as if a lot of money was being thrown at him. Because of the worries in her timid heart, Mina decided to return the lottery ticket to Kang Soo. Just as she was about to take out ticket, Song Joon appeared in time. He crazily searched for reasons to change the subject. At that moment, Kang Soo, a perfectionist, kept grumbling and complaining. Mina always nagged about small money, but when she saw Kang Soo bragging about being very rich, she became so angry she couldn't hold back and retorted him. Mina decided not to return the ticket to him anymore. Sung Joon even secretly told a foreign astronaut about the lottery ticket. Kang Soo was completely unaware of winning the lottery. At this time, he had just finished observing the 7 embryos. After observation, he confirmed all 7 embryos were very healthy. Then they just needed to be frozen and brought back to Earth. Kang Soo contacted the chairman to report this good news. The chairman was delighted and asked Kang Soo to take pictures of the embryos. He wanted to see his grandchildren in the space station. Because she was betrayed by her boyfriend, Eve found half a bottle of alcohol hidden by Gong Ryong. She planned to get drunk until the liquid in the bottle turned into droplets. Eve could not drink comfortably at all. At this time, Kang Soo had just completed determining the gender of the 7 embryos, including both male and female. He proved that the chairman was about to have several grandsons and granddaughters. Kang Soo sent photos of the fertilized embryos to the chairman. Unexpectedly, at that moment, Eve barged in. Kang Soo hurriedly placed the fertilized embryos into the incubator. Eve, a very serious and meticulous worker, noticed something unusual. She saw that the temperature and oxygen levels in the incubation chamber were not suitable for the living conditions required by fruit flies. Eve always believed that Kang Soo was researching fruit flies, but very quickly she saw images of fertilized eggs on the computer. Kang Soo hurriedly lied, saying those were images of cell division in fruit flies. However, Eve's biological knowledge allowed her to recognize the images as human embryos. Eve discovered that Kang Soo was using fruit fly research as a cover to conduct fertilized egg experiments, which violated space law. She continuously questioned Kang Soo and bluntly told him that his actions were strictly forbidden. With a serious expression, she demanded that he immediately open the incubation box. Having no choice, he was forced to comply. After several astronauts checked, they confirmed that inside the box were indeed human fertilized eggs. Eve questioned Kang Soo about how he brought human eggs into the space station and who owned them. To keep the secret, Kang Soo began to lie spontaneously, saying the eggs were experimental items donated by a bank. He avoided mentioning Gong Ryong's name, only saying the eggs were hidden under a glass bottle and secretly brought into space by him. Regarding the sperm, Kang Soo falsely claimed it was taken from a foreign astronaut named Santiago and stored in a frozen warehouse. Kang Soo believed this act directly and effectively solved the problem of human infertility. However, Eve, a principled person, insisted on eliminating these embryos. Kang Soo was completely at a loss to respond. Finally, Gong Ryong chased after Eve and tried to persuade her, arguing that the embryos that had already formed were life and whether to keep them alive or not should be their own decision. Eve believed that embryos nurtured in space under radiation and cosmic rays might develop unpredictably. She harshly threw the embryos into the disposal machine. Witnessing this, Gong Ryong felt extremely disappointed. He called Eve a murderer. There was a time when Gong Ryong thought space was like a mother's womb, but Eve's actions made him realize this place was not where life is born, but where death occurs. He even regretted his feelings for Eve and and wanted to take back his confession from the day before. Eve, however, did not care about that. She contacted ground control to report that Kang-soo had conducted unauthorized human fertilization experiments and demanded his resignation. Ground control decided to keep Eve's position as commander but removed Kang-soo from the expedition team and revoked his astronaut status. Besides reporting to Earth, Eve also forcibly confiscated Kang-soo's microscope. From now on, anyone who wanted to use the microscope had to get her permission, and the entire experiment process would be monitored and recorded. The chairman knew nothing about all this. He was still celebrating and planning for his daughter to break up with Gong Ryong. He planned to wait until his grandson grew up and then hand over the corporation to him. Meanwhile, Kang-soo called to report the events happening in space. Although Gong Ryong still had some eggs stolen from Kang-soo, without the microscope, embryo experiments were impossible. Upon hearing this, the chairman instantly went from joy to sorrow, and he even fainted on the spot due to overwhelming emotions. Fortunately, the chairman had no serious issues. When he woke up, he instructed his daughter to contact Gong Ryong. Now his only hope was the eggs in Gong Ryong's possession. However, Go-eun refused to follow her father's wishes. Go-eun worried that Gong Ryong would also be arrested. Min-jung became even more disappointed and decided to give up. After watching the final video about the love story with her late husband, Min-jung thought the death. But Gong Ryong, persistent about life, did not give up. Currently, he still had 3 eggs in his hands. In 3 days, Gong Ryong would have to return to Earth, but the embryos needed 3 days to develop into embryos. Therefore, for Gong Ryong, tonight was his last chance. Since there was no microscope available, Gong Ryong planned to use a micropipette to achieve the effect of a microscope. The greatest difficulty was the zero-gravity state in space. Because he could not stand firmly, Gong Ryong struggled to fix the eggs in place and was even less able to accurately inject the sperm. In this emergency, Gong Ryong's friend on Earth inspired him, suggesting he just needed to find a few people to hold his arms and legs. Gong Ryong immediately came up with the idea to ask the remaining astronauts for help. Coincidentally, Sung-joon overheard the story about Mina finding a lottery ticket, so he discussed splitting the lottery ticket into 3 parts. One for Santiago, because he would return to Earth in 3 days and only he could redeem it in time. Mina finally had no choice but to agree. Additionally, after discussion, the 3 of them, including Mina, accepted Gong Ryong's proposal as a trade. Gong Ryong would not reveal the secret about the lottery ticket to Kang-soo, and Mina would hold Gong Ryong to help him stay fixed. Santiago remained worried and asked Gong Ryong to explain the purpose. With time pressing, Gong Ryong had to tell the truth. Upon hearing that a human embryo experiment was about to be conducted, the astronauts began to hesitate, fearing that if discovered, they would lose their astronaut positions like Kang-soo. Gong Ryong reminded them about the 5 trillion won lottery ticket and urged them not to give up such a huge fortune. Among the astronauts, Santiago was the first to make a decision. In fact, he had a condition similar to the chairman's son. His sperm was unhealthy and he couldn't reproduce. Every day, he could only look at attractive women in magazines while collecting his sperm for experiments. It turned out that he deeply desired to have children. From the perspective of a parent wanting offspring, Santiago agreed with Gong Ryong's proposal. Soon after, Mina and Sung-joon also agreed to participate. At night, while Eve was asleep, Gong Ryong quietly left the resting room. After preparations, Santiago and Sung-joon held Gong Ryong's legs while Mina monitored outside. Thus, an experiment to create life was about to begin. Because his body was fixed, Gong Ryong successfully caught the sperm. Unfortunately, the micro-suction tube kept shaking during the process, causing the first egg to be pierced and die. Now Gong Ryong had only 2 eggs left. The second time, Gong Ryong maintained absolute concentration. He successfully attached the egg to the suction tube. Next, he needed to implant the sperm into the egg. Sadly, due to excessive force, the sperm accidentally slipped outside the egg. The second egg was ruined as well. Now, Gong Ryong had only 1 last egg remaining. This time, he had to inject the sperm precisely into the center of the egg to succeed. Unexpectedly, just as Gong Ryong was about to inject, Eve appeared. Some time ago, Gong Ryong had helped Eve choose mice for experiments. Now, Eve woke up in the middle of the night to find 2 mice mating. Excited, she intended to share this good news with Gong Ryong. Because Gong Ryong was not found in the resting chamber, Eve shifted her search to the astronauts' lounge. Mina, responsible for cooling down the area, hurriedly handled the situation while reminding those inside. When Santiago and Sung-joon heard the noise, they immediately hid Gong Ryong along with the sperm and eggs. When Eve entered, the 2 tensely pretended not to see Gong Ryong. Unexpectedly, Eve suspected them of secretly drinking alcohol and wanted to inspect the lounge. Seeing Eve about to open the spacesuit where Gong Ryong was hiding, Sung-joon quickly stopped her. He admitted they had been drinking and apologized. Fortunately, Eve did not continue to disturb them. Such a crisis was thus averted. After Eve left, Gong Ryong resumed the experiment. Finally, he placed the eggs at the tips of 2 pipettes so that they would drop exactly in the center of the culture dish. Everyone held their breath. Gong Ryong was extremely focused. His absolute calm under great pressure finally succeeded in perfectly injecting the sperm into the egg. The moment the task was completed, Gong Ryong seemed to have shed a heavy burden. Next, he only needed to wait for the embryos to develop from the fertilized eggs. While waiting, Gong Ryong went to talk with Eve. As they spoke, their eyes accidentally met. Eve couldn't help but recall the time before going to space when the ground control center asked her to take care of Gong Ryong. Eve immediately refused, thinking Gong Ryong knew nothing about space. But now, Eve smiled. Through a camera, Doma witnessed the intimate scene between Eve and Gong Ryong while observing the test mice. Thinking about their closeness, Doma anxiously looked at the cigarette in his hand. At that moment, Tae-hee approached, and Doma immediately kissed her. A few days ago, Tae-hee came to Eve's house to help turn off TV. Seeing Doma there, Tae-hee immediately said in a suggestive tone that it was very hot and even deliberately took off her jacket. Doma immediately understood and became intimate with her right at his girlfriend's house. At that moment, Tae-hee kissed Doma again with a passionate expression. Unexpectedly, Doma said he was just confused with Tae-hee because he was about to quit his job. Although they had helped Gong Ryong, the astronauts later felt the action was inappropriate. To uphold their honor as astronauts, they discussed and decided to return the lottery ticket to Kang-soo. That night, Eve received a call from Mission Control. From ground observations, the space station was drifting toward a large amount of space debris. Although the probability of collision was only 1 in 10,000, ground control still notified Eve to prepare a response. After receiving the call, Eve quickly adjusted the orbit and successfully avoided the debris. At night, Gong Ryong secretly left the resting chamber. While Eve was asleep, he prayed for the embryo's successful development. After praying, Gong Ryong noticed Eve's toes were completely without bandages. Worried, he held her foot and scolded her for not taking care of herself. Eve seemed to be sleeping very deeply, so Gong Ryong had to change the bandages himself. Watching Eve sleep peacefully before him, Gong Ryong's memories unconsciously returned. 1 year ago, he had heard Eve mock him at the center. Eve thought Gong Ryong didn't understand how to live in space and insisted she would become his caretaker. After hearing this, Gong Ryong had promised Eve he would never cause her trouble. But now, looking at Eve before him, Gong Ryong suddenly realized her words were not wrong. He only caused trouble and truly brought too many difficulties to her. Eve still had not woken up, so Gong Ryong took this opportunity to confess his feelings. When he returns to Earth, he wants to go out with Eve to eat, walk, and watch movies like a normal couple on Earth. After confessing this, Gong Ryong began to observe the culture dish and saw that the embryo was developing healthily. Excited, Gong Ryong called Min Jung to share the good news. The embryo only needed to stay in the incubator for 2 more days, after which he would do his best to bring it back to Earth. Yesterday, Min Jung was desperate and wanted to die, but fortunately, she was found in time and taken to the hospital. Before Gong Ryong's call, Min Jung was still unconscious, but now she had regained consciousness. The chairman could not contain his joy and began to see Gong Ryong as the hero who saved his family. Unfortunately, Kang-soo overheard Gong Ryong's call. Kang-soo, who always looked down on Gong Ryong, was astonished to see him accomplish what he could not. Kang-soo even tried to open the culture box, but couldn't enter the correct password. Gong Ryong paid no attention to Kang-soo and went to have breakfast with everyone. Unexpectedly, during this time, Eve joked about the sweet words Gong Ryong had said to her last night. Eve had actually not slept at all. She remembered all his cares and kind words. At that moment, Kang-soo angrily rushed over, grabbed Gong Ryong tightly and questioned him, unable to understand how Gong Ryong could inject sperm into the egg without a microscope. To stop Kang-soo from revealing the embryo, the astronauts immediately restrained him. While they were in chaos, once again a fragment floated in space. This time, it precisely collided with the adjusted orbit. Ground control quickly issued an alarm and restored Kang-soo's astronaut status. They ordered all personnel on the orbital station to urgently evacuate to the escape pod immediately. As commander, Eve calmly gave decisive orders to the astronauts. They needed to transfer fruit flies and essential test animals like lab mice into the cargo ship. Eve also reminded Gong Ryong to bring his personal belongings. Gong Ryong hurried back to the incubation tank to try to retrieve the embryos inside. Unexpectedly, due to the emergency, the incubation tank automatically locked. Gong Ryong grabbed a tool. At that moment, Kang-soo approached and told Gong Ryong to give up because the fertilized eggs had not developed into embryos. Gong Ryong worriedly asked Kang-soo if there was any place to plug in power on the escape pod, since fertilized eggs needed electricity in the incubator to develop into embryos. For Gong Ryong, it was absolutely impossible to return empty-handed. Seeing Gong Ryong's anxious expression, Kang-soo tried to negotiate conditions. Kang-soo promised to find a power source on the escape pod, but demanded Gong Ryong hand over the fertilized eggs to him. Gong Ryong agreed but requested Kang-soo never let Eve know about this. After reaching the agreement, Kang-soo leisurely went to pack his belongings while Gong Ryong kept struggling to unlock the tank. After a while, Eve led the astronauts into the rescue ship. At this time, space debris was colliding with increasing density. The situation was urgent, but Eve noticed Gong Ryong had not not boarded the ship yet. Mission Control on the ground ordered the waiting status ended and immediately switched to launch mode. They demanded the astronauts urgently return to Earth. However, Gong Ryong was trapped alone in the main section of the spacecraft. Due to the collisions, communication between the main section and the rescue ship was cut off. Gong Ryong repeatedly knocked on the compartment door, but no one could hear him. Kansu volunteered to go rescue Gong Ryong, but ground control sent a message warning that the spacecraft's cabin had developed a crack. They were absolutely forbidden to open the cabin door, or else all the oxygen inside would be lost. In this emergency situation, Eve decided to go rescue Gong Ryong alone. She even planned to perform a dangerous spacewalk. No matter what, she couldn't leave Gong Ryong alone in space. However, people on Earth strongly opposed her, especially Dong-ah, who urged Eve to stay calm and think carefully. The situation became increasingly urgent. Tae-hee promised to send a rescue ship to save Gong Ryong and ordered all astronauts in the escape ship to immediately depart and return. Seeing the astronauts still hesitant, Tae-hee remotely activated the emergency program. The main cabin and the escape pod were separated, and at the same time, she forcibly closed the cabin door. Although anxious, Eve was powerless. Currently, inside the main cabin, Gong Ryong was trying to save himself. He tried to establish contact with the escape pod, but unfortunately, he could not connect. Instead, he received signals from the Earth radio channel. Gong Ryong saw with his own eyes the escape pod continuously drifting away from him, flying toward Earth. He was nearly desperate immediately. Unexpectedly, at that moment, he saw Eve wearing a spacesuit, opening the escape pod door and heading toward him with a spacewalk. Just before the escape pod door closed, Eve hurried to rescue Gong Ryong. Eve requested the door to be reopened and promised to bring Gong Ryong back safely. Ground control finally agreed to Eve's request. Under Earth's command, Eve slowly climbed onto the spacecraft. Thanks to her spacewalking experience, Eve's initial climbing went quite smoothly until the space debris appeared again. Large fragments were hurtling toward the spacecraft at high density. Between life and death, Eve hurried to find shelter inside the spaceship as debris wildly rushed toward her. While dodging, Gong Ryong's words echoed in her mind. He wanted to date and love Eve like normal people once they returned to Earth, experiencing everything together. After a while, the last pieces of debris finally passed, and Eve was relatively safe. She immediately continued crawling along the ship until she reached the front of the main compartment. At the door, Gong Ryong and Eve looked directly into each other's eyes. Eve smiled, but Gong Ryong felt worried, his heart filled only with concern for her. After Eve entered the main compartment, Gong Ryong immediately flew over to hug her tightly, tears falling as he repeatedly apologized. It was all his fault. If he had arrived at the rescue ship in time, Eve wouldn't have had to risk herself to save him. Eve just smiled and reminded Gong Ryong to remember his confession of love, that when they returned to Earth, they would enjoy countless beautiful moments together. Gong Ryong's eyes filled with affection as he looked at Eve. It turned out Eve already knew his silly confession. In a moment, Eve took off her mask, revealing her long hair, and Gong Ryong passionately kissed her in space. She could no longer hide her feelings for him. While they waited for confirmation from Earth to avoid being monitored by Mission Control, Gong Ryong typed a message on his phone and showed it to Eve. On Earth, seeing Eve and Gong Ryong's closeness, Dong-ah felt annoyed inside. Seeing Dong-ah worry for Eve, Tae-hee felt jealous, her words tinged with sadness. Meanwhile, in space, Eve and Gong Ryong awaited the confirmation check. Unexpectedly, the evacuation spaceship exploded due to an oxygen leak, and because of the sudden blast, the escape system was completely disabled. Eve and Gong Ryong's hope of returning to Earth was shattered as the two were trapped in the main compartment, nearly helpless. Eve contacted Mission Control on Earth, which planned to dispatch a rescue ship to fly overhead, and asked Eve to confirm the space station's power reserves. Eve discovered that the solar panels had been burned, meaning they couldn't generate electricity from them, and had to rely solely on emergency power, which she estimated could last at most 2 days. Earth ordered switching to emergency mode to conserve energy, and Eve complied, planning to shut down all power-consuming systems to save energy while waiting for rescue. Meanwhile, news broke on Earth about the astronauts urgently evacuating via the rescue ship. Go-won, unaware of the bad news, ordered the family airline to personally fetch Gong Ryong. The chairman grew even more delighted, guessing the embryos had developed well, and instructed his daughter to bring home her future husband and grandchildren. Just as Go-won eagerly prepared to depart, a news report appeared showing Mission Control answering reporters' questions. As deputy director, Tae-hee did not avoid the truth and revealed that Gong Ryong and Eve were stranded in space, while the other astronauts, including Kang-soo, had landed safely in foreign waters. Tae-hee promised on camera that Mission Control would cooperate with international space agencies to prepare the fastest possible rescue ship. Upon knowing Gong Ryong was trapped, Go-won immediately contacted Kang-soo. After landing in the sea, Kang-soo and the others were taken to a domestic hospital. Go-won angrily scolded Kang-soo for abandoning Gong Ryong and demanded that he return to space to bring people back. Dong-ah was worried worried about Eve and wanted to pilot the spaceship himself into space to rescue her. For Eve, he was always ready to face death. Seeing the man she liked worrying about another woman, Tae fiercely opposed and struck Do-ma hard in the face. If Do-ma went, he would almost certainly die, but he was not afraid. He even planned to withdraw his resignation and threatened that no one, including Tae, could stop him from saving Eve. Meanwhile, in space, Gongryong saw the fertilized egg develop into a healthy embryo. Next, he only needed to bring it back to Earth and implant it into a mother's womb. Gongryong secretly hid the embryo in an experimental container. Eve followed the plan to cut the power and activate the emergency electricity. Because of necessity, she also turned off the dehumidifier, which meant the temperature in the space station would drop sharply. Soon, with many devices turned off, the space station grew almost pitch dark, and the temperature suddenly fell to -20°C. After being trapped for 30 hours, the emergency power supply was about to run out. To sustain life, Eve decided to immediately cut off communication with Earth and recharge her spacesuit, keeping only the oxygen generator active. During her last contact with Earth, Eve expressed that she would not give up hope and begged Earth not to abandon them. With her farewell to Earth, the official communication was cut off. Mission Control fell silent. Tae had promised Eve that rescue would launch in at least 30 hours, but due to technical issues, Earth was still unprepared. The staff at Mission Control felt worried, knowing that even if rescue launched after 30 hours, Eve and Gongryong would die from oxygen depletion in space. Tae still dared not risk letting Do-ma replace the humanoid model to go into space. She did not want him to sacrifice his life. In space, Eve found 2 cold-proof tents and crawled inside with Gongryong to keep warm. Despite that, the temperature continued dropping to extreme levels. Gongryong's limbs became numb and stiff. Seeing this, Eve gave him a bottle of alcohol. Gongryong took a few sips, which only eased their discomfort slightly. Eve wanted to watch a movie to make time pass faster. Unfortunately, Gongryong's phone accidentally turned off. In this desperate situation, Eve gave Gongryong hope. If they could return safely to Earth, she wanted to go to the cinema with him. Gongryong responded with a smile. He wanted to reveal the secret that he had experimented with fertilization, but after much thought, he couldn't bring himself to say it. Because of the cold, Eve's legs started cramping. Worried, Gongryong crawled out of his tent to massage her. Without the shelter of the tent, Eve feared Gongryong would get cold, so he crawled into Eve's tent. The two of them stayed together to keep warm. Suddenly, Eve said that taking off their clothes would make them warmer. By then, they had stopped paying attention to anything else. After a few sips of alcohol, they took off all their clothes. In the cramped tent, they held each other to keep warm. Gongryong no longer hesitated and spoke honestly about his real purpose for going to space. He also revealed the secret that the fertilized egg had developed into an embryo. However, in this life or death moment, Eve no longer blamed him, but worried about the embryo's survival. Since the embryo had formed, it was a life. If they couldn't return to Earth, 3 lives would be lost in space. Yet at the same time, Eve encouraged Gongryong not to give up. Even if she and he were to die tragically, Earth would surely send a spaceship to bring the embryo back for implantation. For them, this was hope. Hearing this, Gongryong kissed Eve. To be able to hold each other in despair with Eve, even if they died, Gongryong felt fulfilled. After saying this, Gongryong and Eve clung to each other. Gongryong and Eve had been trapped in the space station for 40 hours. Do-ma carried his luggage, intending to stay overnight at the command center. The emergency command center was discussing the rescue plan, as the remaining power and oxygen on the space station were low. If they did not send a rescue ship today, Gongryong's and Eve's lives would be seriously at risk. At that moment, Do-ma appeared in the meeting room holding a humanoid model. Initially, the command center planned to use the humanoid model to replace a real person in the space rescue mission, but Do-ma believed the model was still incomplete and could not control the spaceship. Tae strongly opposed this. No matter what, she would not let Do-ma take such a risk. Meanwhile, in the space station, the embryo had divided into cells. The chairman of the conglomerate was very happy. Now, all they needed was for Gongryong to return to Earth to preserve the chairman's bloodline and would do everything to keep the future son-in-law alive. Gongryong's friend overheard the chairman's conversation and frowned slightly. Previously, Gongryong had promised his friend that even if he married Go-eun, he would continue working as an obstetrician. He cared nothing for the tycoon's wealth. At that time, the friend asked Gongryong if he was happy, but Gongryong remained silent. Now, Gongryong and Eve had only 10 hours left to survive. Feeling worried, Go-eun angrily demanded an explanation from Tae, insisting that in an emergency, guests should be evacuated first. Tae said the rescue plan would be carried out quickly, but Go-eun refused to give up. She demanded that Tae provide a specific departure time for the rescue spaceship. Seeing that Tae could not give a definite answer, Go-eun declared she wanted to bring Gongryong's 3 mothers along. They planned to stay at the command center to witness the rescue spaceship take off. When Gongryong was safely back on Earth, the 3 mothers were extremely worried upon hearing he was trapped. Their anxiety caused the first mother to accidentally turn on the gas stove, which which caught fire. The second mother clumsily poured water onto the gas stove, making the fire grow even larger. At that moment, Go-eun arrived outside the store. Seeing the situation, she rushed inside with a fire extinguisher and quickly put out the fire. Unfortunately, she was burned by sparks on her arm. Go-eun was not seriously injured. The three mothers felt guilty, fearing Gong-ryong would blame them upon his return, and worried Go-eun would be angry. But Go-eun did not blame anyone. Instead, she invited the three mothers to the command center, hoping they could all cheer for Gong-ryong together. At that time, the secretary brought news that the rescue spaceship was preparing to depart. Just moments before, Dong-ah had persistently argued, and with the urgency of the situation, Tae-hee finally agreed to let Dong-ah replace the humanoid model to pilot the rescue spaceship. However, since all the space station's systems were damaged, even if Dong-ah successfully piloted the ship into space, it would be difficult for him to complete docking with the space station alone. With everyone's combined efforts, Dong-ah believed they could install 2 robotic arms on the rescue spaceship. The purpose was to capture and connect with the space station. These robotic arms were currently located at a company somewhere in Spain. To borrow the robotic arms, a substantial amount of USD had to be paid. To arrange this, Tae-hee contacted astronaut Santiago, who was born in Spain. Santiago agreed to help lend the robotic arms, and the payment would of course be covered by Kang-soo. As the heir to a global bank, Kang-soo seemed to be the only shining hope at this moment. He promised to purchase the robotic arms, and for him, the cost was truly insignificant. Kang-soo also told Santiago not to bother negotiating over the price. After resolving the issue of the robotic arms, the rescue ship was about to depart. Before departure, Tae-hee repeatedly reminded Dong-ah to control his emotions and insisted that everyone must follow the regulations, or else the risk of death would increase significantly. Dong-ah agreed, fully understanding that Tae-hee's worries were personal. He regretted having betrayed Tae-hee. With no other choice, Tae-hee gave her watch to Dong-ah and personally fastened it on him. She could no longer hold on to someone whose mind was elsewhere. She only hoped Dong-ah could return safely to Earth. Dong-ah was about to board the rescue ship, accompanied by Santiago. 4 astronauts, including Kang-soo, together went to the command center. Driven by guilt, they hoped to see Gong-ryong return to Earth. Unexpectedly, after only a few steps, they staggered and fell to the ground, still unable to adapt to Earth's gravity after just returning. The 4 were then carried into wheelchairs. Only Kang-soo's eyes were fixed on Go-eun. Meanwhile, Dong-ah was already seated in the spaceship. As the countdown sounded, the spaceship began to lift off. However, as the altitude steadily increased, the spaceship started to shake violently, causing one of the robotic arms to fall off due to the vibrations. Worse news came as the space station sent out a warning signal that the life support system inside had been forced to shut down. In other words, even Gong-ryong now had absolutely no oxygen left to breathe. Dong-ah continued to pilot the rescue ship upward. Finally, the spaceship approached the space station's orbit. Thanks to his experience as an astronaut, Dong-ah skillfully and precisely controlled the robotic arm to grasp the space station. The danger was that relying on only one robotic arm wasn't enough force. A slight mistake could send the rescue ship tumbling out of orbit. Dong-ah quickly connected the docking device. Fortunately, after a few tense minutes, the probe device perfectly linked to the space station. Then, Dong-ah opened the hatch and entered the station. By this time, the temperature inside had dropped to freezing. Dong-ah searched around and finally found Gong-ryong trapped inside. Hearing Dong-ah calling him, Gong-ryong slowly opened his eyes. Luckily, he was still alive. Dong-ah continued searching and found women's underwear floating inside the station. Following that direction, he found Eve, but when he opened the cold-resistant sleeping bag, the sight shocked him. Inside, Eve and Gong-ryong were completely naked, holding each other tightly. The urgent call from the command center echoed in Dong-ah's ears, pulling him back to focus. He quickly called Eve's name, and luckily, she gradually regained consciousness, still breathing faintly. Dong-ah swiftly lifted both her and the sleeping bag onto the rescue ship and helped them put on survival suits. Eve was almost fully awake and very surprised to see Dong-ah in front of her. Gong-ryong had also regained consciousness and had already spoken with his mother at the command center, and Go-eun's anxiety finally eased. At this moment, she couldn't wait to see Gong-ryong on Earth. Watching Go-eun confess her love to another man, Kang-soo quietly signed beside them. Once everything was ready under ground control's command, Dong-ah led Eve and Gong-ryong back to Earth. However, the 3 of them were still not completely out of danger because their spacesuits were not custom-made and struggled to withstand the shocks during re-entry. Additionally, the spacecraft's control system malfunctioned, causing extremely high temperatures. Due to friction, all 3 endured intense vibrations and pain like being burned by fire. In this critical situation, Dong-ah deployed the parachute, allowing the spacecraft to land on the sea. At the same time, the signal disappeared and communication was interrupted. Watching the spacecraft vanish from the radar, the command center fell into silence. Everyone imagined the worst outcomes. Fortunately, the spacecraft successfully avoided burning and resurfaced from the water. The 3 were lucky to return safely. safely. Communication was quickly restored. The command center received the successful rescue report from Dong-a. In moments, the command center erupted in ecstatic joy. Even Kang-soo breathed a sigh of relief. Inside the rescue ship, all three were moved to tears with happiness. After arriving on Earth, the media continuously asked many questions. Dong-a did not avoid his feelings. He openly admitted his romantic relationship with Eve. He frankly said that he went to space not only to save Gong Ryong, but to save the woman he loved most on Earth. Reporters then asked about Gong Ryong and Go-eun's marriage plans, questioning when they intended to marry. Moreover, the media was very curious about how Gong Ryong and Eve survive in the freezing environment of the space station. In fact, at that time, Eve had found a few oxygen tanks brought along in the space station, each capable of sustaining them for 10 minutes. Using those scarce oxygen tanks, the two naked people held each other inside the tent. On the brink of life and death, Gong Ryong promised Eve many things. If they could safely return to Earth, he would kiss her every 15 minutes. They would eat hot cup noodles together and grow old side by side. However, facing the reporters, the two could not reveal everything that had happened. Yet it was clear to almost everyone what Eve and Gong Ryong had truly done inside the space station. Realizing her boyfriend might have betrayed her, Go-eun smoked alone with a heavy heart. Kang-soo quietly approached and took the cigarette from her hand. Noticing the burn mark on her arm, he kept speaking words of concern for the woman he cared about, while also reminding her that some of her suspicions might be true. Since Gong Ryong and Eve had just returned to Earth, they needed to be hospitalized to help their bodies adjust to gravity. Tae-hee asked Eve about the situation, wanting to know why Gong Ryong was trapped in the main cabin. Eve chose to help Gong Ryong keep the secret and didn't mention anything about herself and Gong Ryong. But Dong-a's gaze was unusual. He clearly realized his girlfriend was lying. When Gong Ryong was hospitalized and it was inconvenient to undress, Dong-a volunteered to help him to the bathroom. Gong Ryong sensed Dong-a's bad intentions. Indeed, in an instant, Dong-a changed his tone and demanded that from now on, Gong Ryong should no longer be close to Eve. Dong-a reminded Gong Ryong that Go-eun was his woman and Eve was his woman. Gong Ryong did not argue. After Dong-a left, Gong Ryong struggled to take off his sock. At this time, the chairman came to visit Gong Ryong. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Gong Ryong pretended to vomit and slipped the sock into the chairman's hand, hinting that this was what he needed. The chairman understood immediately. As expected, he pulled out a frozen box from inside the sock, and inside the box was the embryo developed from the sperm. Go-eun came to the hospital room, happily informing Gong Ryong that the embryo was very healthy. Overjoyed, Go-eun repeatedly kissed Gong Ryong, though he resisted somewhat. Taking advantage of the moment, Go-eun asked about the worries in his heart. She wanted to know if he and Eve had done inappropriate things in space. Gong Ryong did not answer directly but advised Go-eun not to waste her time on him. There was a time when he tried to convince himself that gradually he would come to like her, but when she announced their engagement, he realized his heart never belonged to her. Gong Ryong apologized to Go-eun for his deception and betrayal. Go-eun immediately looked saddened and felt utterly pitiful. After leaving Gong Ryong's room, Go-eun hid alone in the stairwell and cried. Kang-soo saw this but did not approach. He only felt regretful and sad for her. Unexpectedly, after crying, Go-eun regained her composure and went to see Gong Ryong. She declared she would never believe his lies and was sure that he loved her. She thought what he said was just angry words to retaliate because her father did not trust him. Later, Go-eun contacted Gong Ryong's three mothers, trying to build a good relationship. She hoped to visit Gong Ryong with them and even asked the three mothers to call her the future daughter-in-law at the hospital to teach Gong Ryong a lesson. Kang-soo forced himself to continue high-intensity rehabilitation exercises despite his body not being fully recovered. Without waiting for complete healing, he hurriedly and chaotically went searching for Gong Ryong to cause trouble. Suddenly, he ripped off his oxygen mask and struck Gong Ryong hard, wishing that Gong Ryong would die from lack of oxygen. Witnessing this scene, Eve did not intervene in the fight but only showed a worried expression. After Kang-soo was pulled away, Eve felt helpless, unsure how to resolve this complicated relationship. Just a moment later, Dong-a ran into the hospital room, knelt before Eve, and slapped Gong Ryong several times. He confessed that he had an affair with Tae-hee, but declared that he only loved Eve and hoped that one day she could forgive him. Eve did not blame him, nor did she have any reason to do so. Gong Ryong witnessed this entire scene from his hospital bed. Coincidentally, it was Dong-a's birthday, and the astronauts organized a celebration for him. Taking advantage of the distraction, Dong-a dismantled the body model, insisting that he would personally go to space to perform the rescue. After taking apart the model, Dong-a felt guilty, crying while silently hoping that Eve would wait for him a little longer. He vowed that no matter how afraid he was, he would never let his girlfriend die. Seeing this touching image, Eve's eyes welled with tears, but Gong Ryong felt uncomfortable inside. Minjung also expressed her gratitude to Gong Ryong, saying that thanks to him, she was finally able to become a mother, and millions of infertile couples on Earth would now now have hope. Gong Ryong sadly replied that he was not that great. After all, he was just a speck of dust in the vast universe. Min Jung encouraged Gong Ryong to trust in the vast universe, saying that he would surely find someone who loves him and hold hands with her until they grow old together. Eve was intently looking at the painting in her hands. This was the gift Gong Ryong had secretly left on her plate for her today. Each cute drawing inside was hand-painted by Gong Ryong himself. On it, Gong Ryong asked Eve if she wanted to go watch a movie and take a walk to enjoy delicious food together. Eve smiled gently. In her mind, scenes of dating with Gong Ryong appeared. In spring, they would watch a touching film at the theater. In autumn, they would walk through a forest full of fallen leaves and take beautiful photos. When winter came, they would reserve a table at a restaurant to enjoy hot delicacies. Finally, they wanted to get haircuts together. All of these were wishes Gong Ryong longed to fulfill with Eve on Earth. After looking through all the paintings, Eve went to Gong Ryong's hospital room. Since she had seen Dong-a's sincere feelings for her, Gong Ryong was feeling down at this time. Unexpectedly, Eve suggested they go to the convenience store together. At night, the two of them sat in wheelchairs and went to a busy intersection, then crossed the crosswalk to the convenience store on the other side. Outside the store, Eve and Gong Ryong ordered a hot bowl of noodles, freely enjoying a feeling that was impossible in space. Gong Ryong felt extremely satisfied. Suddenly, Eve proposed that Gong Ryong forget what had happened in space, that their kisses and affection were like a beautiful dream. Now back on Earth, Eve had to face her boyfriend Dong-a, a man willing to sacrifice his life to save her. As for Gong Ryong, he could no longer avoid his relationship with Go-eun. He needed to become Go-eun's fiancé. They could not betray and hurt the people who loved them just because of the short days spent in space. Gong Ryong could not accept this. He believed her words were just a way to avoid facing her true feelings. Eve saw the determined look in Gong Ryong's eyes. After being discharged from the hospital, the first plan Eve wanted to carry out was to end things with Gong Ryong. But when she returned home and saw the image of herself and Gong Ryong returning from space on a magazine cover, she felt her heart stir once again. Gong Ryong was also unsettled. When his mother found out that Gong Ryong and Eve were naked together in space, she warned him never to betray Go-eun. No matter how urgent the situation, Gong Ryong must never remove underwear in front of another woman besides Go-eun. Gong Ryong's heart was in turmoil. He kept recalling Eve's firm words. That night, facing Eve's decisiveness, Gong Ryong's eyes were full of sorrow. He guessed that Eve wanted to succeed, and so pushed away the man who embarrassed her. She wanted to hide the shameful things that happened in space. Eve lied, saying what happened with Gong Ryong was just an embarrassing one-night stand. Gong Ryong believed she was telling the truth. A few days later, the astronauts returned to the hospital for checkups. Gong Ryong also returned to the hospital to continue working as a doctor. Eve deliberately chose Gong Ryong's doctor friend to examine her. Knowing that Eve was intentionally avoiding him, Gong Ryong felt sad once again. Meanwhile, Go-eun was crying alone. In the previous days, Gong Ryong had spoken coldly to her, hoping she would not waste time on him. Now Go-eun was heartbroken, but vowed to win back Gong Ryong's heart. Kang-soo was at home, constantly recalling the first time he met Go-eun, a few years ago, to pray for his deceased older brother. Go-eun followed her father to a temple. The chairman demanded that Go-eun kneel more than 1,000 times so that her brother could rest in peace. However, during the ritual, he left early and allowed Kang-soo to enter the main hall to perform the rites on his behalf. Kang-soo, undeterred by hardship, knelt thousands of times. But halfway through, Go-eun stubbornly played her late brother's favorite song, Inside the Hall, challenging the Buddha himself. Kang-soo thought this act was inappropriate and frankly said that the Buddha must be angry. Go-eun insisted that the Buddha was smiling. In other words, only a heart with mountains can see mountains. Go-eun boldly said the Buddha was only angry with Kang-soo. Stubborn yet smart and beautiful. That was Kang-soo's first impression of Go-eun. After the ritual ended, Kang-soo sat beside Go-eun and openly confessed his feelings for her. Go-eun asked Kang-soo why he often went to space. Was it to flaunt his family's wealth? Kang-soo didn't answer directly, but instead pointed to the stars in the night sky and shared knowledge about the constellations. Then he teased her to comfort her sorrow over losing her brother. For the first time, Go-eun smiled at Kang-soo. Seeing this, Kang-soo confessed his feelings once again, yearning to be by her side. Because of this yearning, Kang-soo still clung tightly to Go-eun now. Kang-soo went to the restaurant where Go-eun was eating to continue pursuing her. Go-eun wanted to know if Gong Ryong and Eve had done anything inappropriate on the space station. Kang-soo didn't answer. He wanted Go-eun to ask Gong Ryong, the person involved. At the same time, his tone was firm, showing he didn't care about Gong Ryong and Eve's relationship. He only cared about Go-eun. A few weeks later, Eve was set to return to space for a mission. This time, Dong-ah hoped Eve would refuse the mission. He hoped that Eve would go with him to the United States to rest for 1 or 2 years. He did not expect that Eve would not only refuse, but also frankly say she had no intention of continuing to be his girlfriend. Although Dong-ah risked his life to save her from space, she could not forgive his betrayal. betrayal. She wished that they could break up peacefully and remain ordinary colleagues. Doma was angry and humiliated. He questioned Eve about her relationship with Gongryo. Doma even suspected that Eve proposed the breakup because she had fallen in love with another man. Eve did not explain. Now she was determined to cut ties with Doma because he betrayed her. At the ground command center, Deputy Director Tae-hee was watching images of Eve hugging Gong Ryong in the space station. Subordinates all suspected that Gong Ryong and Eve definitely had a dubious relationship. Otherwise, with Eve's personality, she would not have acted like that, even in a life or death situation. To verify, Tae-hee contacted Gong Ryong. Eve also instructed Gong Ryong and herself to write a separate report detailing their experiences during the last 3 days on the space station. She required the report to be detailed and truthful, down to every minute that passed. Eve reminded Gong Ryong absolutely not to write about them kissing. Still angry with Eve, Gong Ryong lied that he did not remember what she said. Back home, Gong Ryong sat before his computer and began to write, but his mind only pictured intimate moments with Eve in space. As a result, he could not write a single word. Eve called, worried Gong Ryong might write something inappropriate. She planned to prepare a proper statement for him in advance. Gong Ryong felt confused inside. He decided to start writing randomly. Eve called a second time and carefully cross-checked details with him. Gong Ryong was still angry at her and told her not to worry about him. A few days later, Eve kept contacting Gong Ryong, wanting to know the progress of the report writing. Gong Ryong found every excuse to hang up. Looking at the experimental box containing mice brought back from space, Eve's eyes lit up with joy. The stitches on the mice's bodies were still Gong Ryong's masterpiece. In front of colleagues, Eve continuously praised the doctor's sewing technique, but what she truly longed for was the person who made those stitches. Not long after, the astronauts and people from the command center came to Gong Ryong's restaurant to celebrate. Gong Ryong thanked everyone, saying that thanks to them, he could return to Earth safely. However, during the event, Doma got drunk. In front of everyone, Doma asked Gong Ryong if he liked Eve. According to Doma, Eve used to be the official space commander, but now Gong Ryong had caused her to be pointed at by others. Doma said he had spent 10 years conquering Eve's heart, but Gong Ryong, clearly engaged to the only daughter of a tycoon, still wanted to confuse Eve and ruin her future. Gong Ryong did not hesitate to admit his feelings for Eve. In his eyes, Eve treasured every life in the universe, but was willing to risk her own life to save him. He could not help but love such a woman. Hearing this, Doma punched Gong Ryong. Gong Ryong did not fight back. He thought he deserved it. At the same time, Gong Ryong told everyone that he only liked Eve unilaterally and lied that Eve did not like him at all. After the party, Eve came downstairs to Gong Ryong's place and asked him to go with her to the space agency to write the report. Gong Ryong opened the door and invited her into his house to write. Eve hesitated but eventually left. A while later, after Gong Ryong finished showering, he found Eve had entered his house on her own. Eve angrily confronted Gong Ryong, asking if he truly did not remember their intimate moments together in space. Unable to hold back any longer, Gong Ryong said he didn't understand why she hesitated with him like that. He kept questioning Eve relentlessly. Eve finally admitted the truth. From the moment Gong Ryong stitched her toe back in space, she couldn't stop the feelings growing inside her. She repeatedly said she hated him. Gong Ryong just smiled, knowing Eve had never truly forgotten him. In the next moment, Eve rushed forward and kissed Gong Ryong, unable to hide her true feelings any longer. However, unexpectedly, their tender words seemed to be overheard by Go-eun outside the door. Go-eun came to Gong Ryong's house and saw Eve inside with her boyfriend. Afterwards, Go-eun invited Eve to talk at a bar. At the bar, Go-eun ordered a bottle of alcohol to challenge Eve to a drinking contest. The winner would get Gong Ryong. Eve accepted the challenge. Eve drank each glass poured by Go-eun. After 2 bottles, Eve apologized to Go-eun, saying she had tried hard to control her heart, but ultimately realized she couldn't. Go-eun smiled gently, saying Gong Ryong was just an obstetrician without much money who needed her and her family's wealth. Go-eun believed Gong Ryong was only experimenting with Eve for a short time and would soon get bored and return to her. Go-eun wanted to watch Gong Ryong rise step by step, but Eve disagreed and even wanted to finish all the 4 alcohol in front of Go-eun. At that moment, Gong Ryong called Eve jealous. Go-eun didn't expect that Gong Ryong would contact her right after. This time, Go-eun won. Late at night, the 2 drunken women returned home together, planning to spend the night there. Faced with the situation, Gong Ryong could only helplessly cover the 2 women with a blanket. The next day, Gong Ryong and Eve submitted their reports. Since they had prepared their statements in advance, the contents they wrote were almost identical, which dispelled Tae-hee's suspicions. However, after Gong Ryong left, Tae-hee warned Eve to stay away from him, fearing that Eve's future as an astronaut might be ruined. Unexpectedly, the 2 had secretly planned to love each other. A few days later, Eve would return to space once again. This time, Doma also wanted to go along, officially to repair the damaged space station, but in reality to be close to Eve and win back her heart. Later, Eve, Doma, and and Tae-hee began inspecting the spaceship. Taking the opportunity, Eve asked Do-ma who he liked more, her or Tae-hee. Tae-hee, curious, asked the same question. Do-ma hesitated and could not answer. At night, when Gong-ryong finished work and returned home, he found Eve at his restaurant. That morning, the three mothers had discussed Gong-ryong and Eve embracing each other naked, worrying whether Eve was deliberately seducing Gong-ryong. So they contacted Gong-ryong to take Eve home for a meal, hoping to use the opportunity to interrogate her. Gong-ryong clearly understood the mother's intentions and told them not to interfere in his affairs. But the mothers wouldn't stop. They contacted Eve through Gong-ryong's friend. At the dinner table, the mothers tried to find reasons to send Gong-ryong away, saying he was just an immature boy attracted to novelty who might lose his judgment in a moment of impulse. They advised Eve not to care about a man like that. Eve politely smiled, seeming to agree with their words. But behind their backs, she secretly dated him at the bus station without letting the mothers know. Starting the next day, Eve and Gong-ryong officially dated in secret, hiding it from everyone. First, the two went to the bathhouse to enjoy a hot bath. Then they went to a bakery together and admired the warm fresh pastries inside. Kang-soo, however, could not accept this. The previous day, some astronauts had stolen Kang-soo's lottery ticket to redeem the prize. Unexpectedly, Kang-soo discovered them and took back ticket. The two astronauts did not hesitate to kneel and apologize to Kang-soo. After some explanation, they inadvertently blamed Gong-ryong. From then on, Kang-soo grew increasingly annoyed with Gong-ryong. Kang-soo believed Gong-ryong had made a habit out of taking his things. The next day, by coincidence, Kang-soo's father called to inform him that the Gowan Corporation had switched their cooperating bank to another institution. He demanded Kang-soo immediately resolve the issue. Kang-soo decisively went to find Gowan's father to demand an explanation. He not only requested the cooperation be switched back to his family's bank, but also threatened that Gowan was his woman. Unexpectedly, the chairman's attitude had drastically changed. Since Gong-ryong overcame difficulties and successfully brought the embryo back, the chairman began to acknowledge Gong-ryong as a persistent man who never gave up. Kang-soo bluntly stated the truth that Gong-ryong had fallen in love with another woman. Upon hearing this, the chairman immediately became angry. He called Gong-ryong over and scolded him harshly, asking if Gong-ryong had any other women. If so, he threatened to make sure Gong-ryong could never be a doctor on all of Earth. As Gong-ryong was about to speak the truth, Go-eun arrived fiercely. She defended him and even turned to criticize Kang-soo for pestering her. Go-eun believed that Kang-soo did not truly like her. He only wanted a marriage of convenience. In front of her father, Go-eun repeatedly criticized Kang-soo's faults. When they were dating, Kang-soo was only interested in studying fruit flies, and to him, she seemed merely a companion. Because of his daughter's words, the father's attitude changed once again. Afterwards, he kindly inquired about Gong-ryong and then kicked Kang-soo out. Kang-soo was furious inside. He even kicked and broke Gong-ryong's car side mirror. He believed Gong-ryong had stolen his money and the woman he cared about. This time, he intended to settle the score with Gong-ryong. The two men fought fiercely until Go-eun decided to throw an object at them, hoping to end this foolish love conflict. Not long after, Kang-soo's unauthorized sperm experiments on the space station were discovered, violating aerospace regulations. The command center planned to interrogate and monitor Kang-soo. After the meeting, Do-ma once again warned Eve not to get too close to Gong-ryong. Eve ignored the advice because she was about to go to space and only wanted to cherish every moment with Gong-ryong. Do-ma still wanted to know if Eve had crossed any boundaries with Gong-ryong. Eve admitted she had, but Do-ma refused to believe it, as he saw Eve as a commander with firm principles. Feeling sad, Do-ma prepared to finish work, but a passing water truck sprayed him all over. The driver was Tae-hee, who did it deliberately to tease Do-ma. It was raining heavily, and Eve had no umbrella. She risked running out into the rain. Meanwhile, at the intersection, Gong-ryong had been waiting for some time. He helped Eve hold the umbrella and sheltered her as they crossed the street. He embraced her and spoke sweet words. But unexpectedly, Tae-hee saw this scene. From then on, Tae-hee began to suspect the relationship between the two. Later, back at the space agency, she reviewed surveillance videos of Gong-ryong and Eve hugging. In the footage, Tae-hee noticed something behind them, a cultivation cage. She extracted the data display and saw that the power source for the cage was active at that moment, meaning someone was using it. Combined with Kang-soo's unauthorized sperm experiments, Tae-hee quickly suspected that Gong-ryong and Kang-soo were accomplices. She guessed the real reason Gong-ryong stayed in the main cabin was because of this cultivation cage. That night, both Kang-soo and Gong-ryong were called to the space agency. They firmly denied the accusations. Fortunately, the surveillance video evidence was insufficient, so they escaped serious trouble when leaving the agency. Tae-hee then asked Gong-ryong whether his feelings for Eve were serious. From Tae-hee's perspective, it was very difficult for Eve to become a commander, and Gong-ryong should not cause trouble for her with a moment's recklessness. Gong-ryong admitted he was just an ordinary person and could not do much for Eve, but at least when Eve went to space, he would quietly support her from behind so she would not feel alone. Eve discovered something strange. The experimental mice brought back from space were pregnant. Excited, Eve immediately contacted Gong Ryong, confirming that the pregnancy was the result of mating in space. The ability to create life in a zero-gravity environment was truly a miracle. Gong Ryong hurried to the space agency to perform ultrasounds on the mice. Eve and Gong Ryong were filled with hope. They believed that pregnancy of the experimental mice would bring new hope to those struggling with infertility. The news of the pregnant mice greatly excited the space agency, and everyone was happily talking about it. Kang Soo was about to be fired, but he was not happy inside. Earlier, Kang Soo had been interrogated for conducting unauthorized fertilization experiments in space. The other astronauts, protecting themselves, refused to explain or support him. Ultimately, Kang Soo was stripped of his astronaut status. In disappointment, he had to hand over all related documents. Before leaving, Kang Soo showed anger, mocking the seemingly sacred profession as he took off his gear. Eve quietly packed Kang Soo's astronaut suit and carefully stored it in a locker. She herself was not comfortable with Kang Soo's dismissal. That day, Eve called Gong Ryong to ask whether the embryo Gong Ryong brought back to Earth was safe. Gong Ryong did not want Eve involved too much and lied that the embryo had not survived, hoping she would soon forget about it. After the call, Gong Ryong went to see Minjung to perform a uterine examination, planning to implant the embryo the day after next. Once implanted, Minjung would have the child she had long wished for. To preserve the chairman's family bloodline, he instructed his subordinates to ensure the hospital's security was flawless. Unexpectedly, Go-eun expressed that she was somewhat bored with Gong Ryong. After he finished the embryo implantation, she would let him go for a while. The chairman thought his daughter was too stubborn, but Go-eun's eyes sparkled. Parting with Gong Ryong was inevitable. The secretary reminded Go-eun that Kang Soo had not revealed Gong Ryong's involvement during his disciplinary hearing. However, Go-eun did not want to thank Kang Soo. She only felt disgusted with him. That night, just after finishing her shower, she heard someone trying to open the door. Upon closer look, Go-eun realized it was Kang Soo, so drunk he could barely stand. Kang Soo wanted to see Go-eun, but without his room card, he kept knocking on the door. Go-eun helped him search for the card. Suddenly, Go-eun discovered a photo of herself that Kang Soo kept in his wallet. When she tried to tear the photo up, Kang Soo, like a child needing to use the bathroom, insisted on going. Having no other choice, Go-eun had to lead Kang Soo to her room. In his drunken state, Kang Soo revealed his true feelings. Because he lost the child with Go-eun, he truly wanted to protect the embryo. Gong Ryong was nurturing. The person bearing the wound of losing a child was also Gong Ryong's mother. Earlier, Eve had come to their house for dinner. During the meal, the first mother heard that Eve was an orphan, abandoned by her birth mother on Christmas night many years ago. Interestingly, on that same Christmas night, the first mother herself had cruelly abandoned her own child in a taxi. To confirm Eve's identity, the first mother went to the space agency to ask about the abandonment years ago. After some hesitation, Eve chose to lie about the details and firmly claimed she was not the first mother's daughter. The first mother left disappointed. Later, Eve took the cup the first mother had drunk from to conduct a DNA test and was shocked to find out she was indeed the first mother's biological daughter. Eve bitterly laughed, then completely destroyed the test report. At that moment, a colleague informed her that pregnant experimental mouse was in critical condition. Eve resolutely rushed to save the mouse, feeling that the dying mouse was like her mother, who had struggled and fought to survive in the past. Eve did not blame Mother because she longed to live. It was just that Eve never expected fate to connect her with Gong Ryong in this way. That night, Gong Ryong came to see Eve, bringing a marriage registration form. Since Eve was about to return to space, Gong Ryong hoped this form would help her feel secure in the lonely space and that he could help her have a family. Eve accepted the marriage registration form Gong Ryong gave her, but did not mention the relationship between herself and the first mother. Returning home, Eve enjoyed the food the first mother had sent her. This was the first time in her life Eve had tasted a dish made by her own mother's hands. The next day, Eve returned the food container to the first mother, hoping she could still eat the delicious dishes she made in the future. The first mother did not know that the person in front of her was her biological daughter. She thought her actions the day before had reminded Eve of Mother. Therefore, she promised to keep making food for Eve. Eve decided to keep the secret, reminding the first mother to forget the events of that Christmas night many years ago. Though in truth, Eve had never given up searching for her mother all those years. Now that she had finally found her, she could not bring herself to tell her the truth. Afterwards, Eve went to the hospital to find Gong Ryong. In a few days, she would leave for space and wanted to cherish every moment with him. Gong Ryong had prepared a gift for Eve's journey. Eve discovered it was a bottle of wine hidden inside a book. She would spend a year in space, and Gong Ryong hoped the wine would give her strength. In the dark, while eating dinner together, Eve asked Gong Ryong about the condition of the embryo about to be implanted. Gong Ryong still refused to answer, but Eve, full of curiosity, continued to ask him for specific details details about the experiment. At that time, Gong Ryong didn't explain clearly, but from his tone, Eve guessed that 3 other astronauts had also helped him. Eventually, Eve didn't press further, choosing to pretend she didn't know out of selfishness for Gong Ryong. However, bad news soon arrived. 2 days ago, ground control had sent astronauts to space to repair the heavily damaged main cabin, where they found Gong Ryong's phone. After the phone was repaired, an unsent message shocked the International Space Agency. Gong Ryong honestly confessed his true purpose for going to space: to experiment with embryos to preserve the lineage of a tycoon family. Seeing the message, Tae-hee felt worried. She suspected Eve knew about this, but did not report it to ground control. She also suspected that Eve and Gong Ryong had cooperated to bring the embryo back to Earth. If this were exposed, the Korean Space Agency would bear full responsibility. Dong-ah proposed first confiscating the embryo, then applying the appropriate punishment to Gong Ryong. Using the phone's location, the command center knew Gong Ryong was currently at the hospital. Tae-hee decided they must control Gong Ryong before the matter leaked. The chairman was completely unaware of this. He arranged many guards to watch the hospital, hoping the embryo implantation surgery tonight would go perfectly. Meanwhile, at the command center, Tae-hee both arranged personnel to the hospital and contacted Eve and the 3 other astronauts, ordering them to come to the command center immediately. Eve felt vague anxiety and tried to contact Gong Ryong, but unfortunately he did not answer. At the hospital, the chairman, worried about the surgery's progress, went alone to the operating room to check on it. Unexpectedly, at that moment, personnel from the command center arrived and demanded the chairman cooperate to halt the surgery. The chairman shouted and refused to comply. Min Jung and Goen, witnessing the scene, hurriedly ran in to inform Gong Ryong. The operating room door couldn't be locked. Dong-ah led people to rush in and seize the fertilized embryo. Gong Ryong tried to lie, but Dong-ah would not accept it. Gong Ryong threatened everyone to back off by risking the safety of the fertilized embryo. Gong Ryong was taken away for violating space research ethics. At the ground command center, Dong-ah kicked Gong Ryong. Gong Ryong took all responsibility upon himself to protect Eve. He lied, saying Eve knew nothing about his actions. Moreover, Gong Ryong repeatedly begged Dong-ah to return the embryo to him. To Gong Ryong, it was an extremely precious life. If Dong-ah was willing to return it, he was ready to accept any punishment. Tae-hee also began questioning Eve about why she knew but didn't report it. Eve could not answer, but Tae-hee guessed Eve kept silent because of her feelings for Gong Ryong. Seeing Eve remain silent, Tae-hee reminded her of the gravity of the situation. If Eve was involved, this would be the ultimate disgrace for the space agency. At that point, the Korean Space Agency would become a laughingstock worldwide. Many responsible people, including Tae-hee, would be fired. Other member countries would take the opportunity to demand Korea conduct other banned experiments. Korea could be permanently banned from space exploration. Eve tried to justify Gong Ryong's actions, arguing that after all, he was nurturing life, not death. Tae-hee became even more serious, saying the United Nations Space Agency would not be as naive as Eve. If the matter were exposed, Gong Ryong would not only face a huge fine, he could even lose his professional license and face criminal prosecution. Such a result was something Eve absolutely did not want to see. To handle the situation properly, Eve requested a private meeting with Gong Ryong. Gong Ryong was worried about Eve's safety and feared she might compromise with the higher-ups. Unexpectedly, his fear came true. To protect Gong Ryong and the other 3 astronauts involved, Eve decided to fulfill her duty as commander by destroying the embryo from the illegal experiment. For a moment, Gong Ryong was almost hopeless. There was a time and space when Eve, like Gong Ryong, had hope for the emergence of life. Gong Ryong kept knocking on the door, begging Eve not to do it. However, no one at the command center listened to him. After a series of procedures, the embryo was quickly destroyed. They brought the destroyed embryo to Eve to meet Gong Ryong, and she instructed him to lie to outsiders, saying the embryo was destroyed at the space station. Only by doing so could Gong Ryong face a lighter punishment. Seeing the sacrificed embryo, Gong Ryong was filled with despair. He believed Eve's action was selfishly calculated. The moment Eve destroyed the embryo was also the moment she killed him. When Gong Ryong blamed her, Eve did not defend herself. To protect Gong Ryong, she was willing to endure all the grievances alone. Knowing the embryo had been discovered, Go-eun hurried to ask Kang-soo to save Gong Ryong. But Kang-soo was not in a rush to go to the command center. Instead, he went to the corporation's kitchen to urgently deal with related equipment. Kang-soo clearly explained to Go-eun the pros and cons. If this matter leaked out, the chairman and the corporation would be completely ruined. In other words, Kang-soo decided to side with the command center. Later, Kang-soo collaborated with Tae-hee to prepare a suitable statement. They decided to let Gong Ryong bear full responsibility alone and not investigate the corporation. That night, Gong Ryong brought the destroyed embryo before the chairman. The chairman angrily scolded Gong Ryong for his inefficiency. Go-eun tried to comfort Gong Ryong and took him home, but Gong Ryong rejected her kindness. He frankly said that right now he was not worthy of Go-eun sacrificing anything for him. After saying that, that, Gong Ryong drove away alone. To silence surrounding opinions, Tae-hee ordered Eve to go to space to carry out the mission of repairing the space station. After this 3-month space trip, Eve's commander position would be revoked. Thus, Eve returned to space once again. 2 months passed and the repair work on the space station was completed. At the same time on Earth, Gong Ryong was tried for harming the space program. The court finally revoked Gong Ryong's medical license and sentenced him to 2 years of probation. Moreover, the corporation annulled the engagement between Go-won and Gong Ryong. Go-won spoke out to defend Gong Ryong in an attempt to save the corporation. Gong Ryong was forced to become an unethical doctor in everyone's eyes. His whole life was almost ruined. The chairman, however, felt no regret. He had known for a long time about what Gong Ryong did in space with Eve. After the verdict, Gong Ryong was deeply disappointed and unable to recover. Every day he drowned his sorrows in alcohol. One evening, Kang-soo met Gong Ryong at the night market, wearing a victorious look. Kang-soo even wished Gong Ryong and Eve happiness. Hearing that, Gong Ryong immediately hit Kang-soo. Kang-soo was not heartless. He advised Gong Ryong to go to the US and retake his medical license. By then, Gong Ryong could still be with Eve abroad. Gong Ryong did not answer. He left without looking back. Currently, he is working as a helper at the Three Mothers restaurant. Every day, he remains silent and focuses only on doing small chores. One day, Min Jung arranged to meet Gong Ryong. She planned to go to the US and, feeling guilty, hoped Gong Ryong would accompany her to pursue further education. Gong Ryong shook his head and refused. At present, he is disheartened about being an obstetrician. He feels scared of delivering babies. Meanwhile, in space, Eve discovered that she was pregnant. She immediately sent an ultrasound image of the baby to Gong Ryong's friend, asking him to check if the child was healthy. After viewing it, he told Eve that the baby was 12 weeks old and developing normally. Eve then asked whether the fetus would be affected when she passed through the atmosphere, returning to Earth. He frankly said that although the fetus is protected by the womb, it cannot withstand the pressure of the atmosphere. The baby might die from lack of oxygen. 2 fellow astronauts overheard Eve talking on the phone. When they knew she was pregnant, they promised not to tell anyone. They also worried about Eve and the baby inside her. Eve told them that the baby's father was Gong Ryong and spoke about how they had been intimate in space. But now she did not know how to tell Gong Ryong. She feared Gong Ryong would hate the child because he hated her. At that point, Eve cried, uncertain about the future. She felt anxious and worried for the child in her womb. After thinking it over, Eve called Gong Ryong, but he stubbornly refused to answer. He was busy at the mother's restaurant and had completely closed off his heart. Meanwhile, Eve was about to return to Earth from space. Before returning to Earth, Eve underwent another ultrasound and discovered that the fetal heartbeat was too fast. Meanwhile, on Earth, Gong Ryong's friend directly confronted him, asking if he had been intimate with Eve, wanting to know who the child in Eve's womb truly belonged to. Gong Ryong was too distracted to answer. At that moment, Eve called Gong Ryong's friend, which made Gong Ryong anxious. In reality, Gong Ryong could never forget Eve. Eve then sent the latest ultrasound image to Gong Ryong's friend, mentioning the rapid fetal heartbeat. Seeing the image and hearing the symbolic heartbeat of life, Gong Ryong's eyes brightened. He explained that an accelerated fetal heartbeat was normal. Hearing that it was his child, Gong Ryong prepared to go to space to meet Eve. As Gong Ryong made this decision, Eve informed the ground control center about her pregnancy. Although shocked, ground control was informed by Eve, who planned to stay in space to give birth. The control center discussed solutions, agreeing that the urgent task was to find an obstetrician who could adapt to the zero-gravity environment and was willing to take the risk. After much consideration, Gong Ryong was the only suitable candidate. Thus, he was called again to the control center. Meanwhile, on the space station, Eve was experiencing abdominal pain, and if not treated quickly, the fetus's life would be in danger. Time was critical. With no other option, the control center urgently requested Gong Ryong to head to the space station. Soon, Gong Ryong traveled to space for the second time aboard a spacecraft. Upon arrival, he immediately performed surgery on Eve, seeing the person she'd always longed for. Eve was so happy she cried. After the surgery, Eve's condition returned to normal, and she and Gong Ryong began a sweet life together in space. Eve named the baby in her womb Baal, meaning star. She hoped Baal would be born safely and witness the vibrant universe firsthand. A few days later, Eve urged Gong Ryong to return to Earth. She clearly understood that Gong Ryong had come to space this time without any training, and if he didn't return quickly, serious consequences could arise. Unexpectedly, Gong Ryong advised Eve to return with him. Of course, the price for Eve returning to Earth would be the sacrifice of the unborn child's life. Gong Ryong knew very well that if Eve needed a cesarean section or encountered any complications during birth, the result would be death. He had no choice but to sacrifice the unborn child to protect Eve's life. Eve didn't want to give up the child. She cried, begging Gong Ryong to return alone, but Gong Ryong became even more determined. If Eve didn't go, he absolutely wouldn't leave either. To protect Gong Ryong, Eve agreed to return to Earth. However, when the spacecraft separated from the space station, Eve's anxiety for the baby caused her blood pressure pressure to rise and her heartbeat to accelerate dangerously. Seeing Eve's life was at risk, ground control ordered the spacecraft to return to the space station, so both Eve and Gong Ryong would remain in space. Gradually, there was only 1 week left until Eve's due date. To prepare for Eve's delivery, Gong Ryong led several astronauts through continuous exercises. The fetus remained quite healthy. Finally, Gong Ryong personally took part in delivering Eve's baby. With each cry, the baby was born safely. Looking at the tiny, precious life before them, Eve and Gong Ryong felt indescribable happiness. Gong Ryong held Eve's hand gently and congratulated her. From that moment, they became parents. However, sadness soon followed. Eve discovered she had fractured her pelvis from overexertion. Ground control had warned early on that a broken pelvis could damage her blood vessels and, if severe, could lead to her death. Looking at the tiny life she had just brought into the world, Eve tearfully thought she might soon have to leave. It turned out that the line between life and death was very thin. Gong Ryong was completely unaware of Eve's condition. He stayed by her side without leaving. A year later, the space fertility clinic led by Kang Soo was established, using the microgravity environment to offer hope to infertile couples on Earth. At the press conference, besides presenting the clinic's benefits, Kang Soo openly confessed his feelings to Go-eun, expressing his desire to have children with her and build a future together. In space, Bale turned 1 year old. For over a year, Gong Ryong stayed at the space station to be with Bale, and vowed not to leave until he found a way to bring Bale safely back to Earth, despite the severe consequences he would face upon return. Tragically, after Bale's birth, Eve's life in the universe ultimately vanished. Fortunately, Bale remained healthy and adorable, gazing every day at the vast space alongside his father. One day, Gong Ryong scattered Eve's ashes into space toward the stars, believing the universe was the path between life and death, where life never ceases amidst the rise and fall of the stars. Bale grew up on Earth and later brought his own children to meet their aging grandfather. Gong Ryong's life was nearing its end, but the cosmic cycle and the lives of all beings continued endlessly. The film ends here. Thank you for your interest and for watching. Goodbye, and see you again.